Well, we on earlier spoke to the former National Security Advisor of United States, John Bolton. He spoke on a range of issues from the botched Afghan pullout to the AUKUS alliance and the future of the India-US relationship.
Ambassador, thank you so much for joining us on WION.
Glad to be with you.
You know, we're speaking on the sidelines of the United Nations General Assembly, and perhaps one of the stories that didn't garner much attention was the one where on Wednesday, the United Nations Security Council extended sanction waivers for more than a dozen Taliban officials to travel abroad for discussions on Afghanistan's stability when their previous deadline ended. The extension was made at the request of the United States, and now the waiver is extended until December 22nd. Do you think the line between engagement and recognition is thinning?
Well, I think the line is thinning, and I think that would be a mistake. I think from the U.S. perspective, there would be very broad support for whatever necessary to allow the departure of additional American citizens of other countries that assisted NATO, and the many Afghans and their families who worked with us over the past 20 years, and to facilitate that, to understand exactly how many people we're talking about, to make the logistical arrangements. I think in the U.S. there'd be very, very strong support for that. Where I don't think there'd be support, and where I think it begins to be a mistake, is to give the impression that we're prepared to accept Taliban's control as completely established and something acceptable. They remain a terrorist group. They may have succeeded in overthrowing the government, but in the 1990s, the U.S. position was very clear that we didn't regard it as a legitimate government, and that was very consequential in the aftermath of 9/11. So I think that the questions of resolving the aftermath of the conflict are legitimate to talk about, but not in any way that gives an impression that we accept this as a done deal.
I guess the concern stems from when people in the Biden administration, like Press Secretary Jen Psaki, call the Taliban businesslike and professional, or when this administration hands over the security of our troops in Afghanistan to the Taliban.
Sure, it worries me quite a bit. I mean, I'm very worried about the direction Biden could go in, but I just want to be sure we don't inadvertently restrict our ability to help get people out who need to get out. And I think that this will be a test, and it will be debated in the United States. What's pressing the Security Council, of course, as well, are China and Russia, which are acting as surrogates for the Taliban. And I think there's support enough on the Council. We don't want to be in a position of getting into a fight on a procedural issue. So I'm relaxed about this short-term extension because I think there are legitimate reasons in the short term to do it. But I think it would be a big mistake for the United States to concede legitimacy to the Taliban government.
During a hearing with lawmakers this week, FBI Director Chris Wray, along with the Director of the National Counterterrorism Center, Christine Abizaid, both expressed concern that the terror group ISIS Khorasan, also known as ISIS-K, seem to be the first Afghan terror group to put U.S. in its sight, and also they suggested that this group could end up becoming even bigger than al-Qaeda.
Well, I think it's a very legitimate concern, and I think Chris Wray, the FBI director, has been focused on this for some time. You know, as between al-Qaeda, Taliban, ISIS-K, it's not like these are groups that have membership cards and that are very fixed and clear. People go back and forth, and ISIS-K and Taliban right now, in a sense, are adversaries for control of Afghanistan. But that could change in a heartbeat, and remembering that ISIS-K's main difference with Taliban is that they're harder line. This is not a debate that's going to get us very far. So I think that the risk of al-Qaeda and ISIS-K and other groups we don't even know about yet establishing sanctuaries in Afghanistan and planning attacks against the U.S. and other friends and allies of ours is very, very real.
And your thoughts on President Biden's over-the-horizon counterterrorism policies?
My view was we never should have withdrawn because by definition, over-the-horizon capabilities are never going to be adequate. You can't gather intelligence effectively when you're not in the country. You can't run networks. You can't have informants that you can talk to and evaluate in real time. You can't be effective at watching what's going on next door in Pakistan or Iran. And so over-the-horizon techniques we will use. And I'm sure the military and intelligence services will do the best they can, but the reality is, as they will tell you, is that it will not be sufficient. So that the risk to the United States of another 9/11, I think, is very real.
To that magnitude?
Well, I think the reason Afghanistan is so attractive to ISIS, Al-Qaeda, and other groups is it's very remote. There are plenty of places where you can't have adequate surveillance. That's why being in country is so important. And if Taliban are in power, they will be a benign government, in effect, enabling these foreign terrorists. So it's not like being in Libya or Syria, which are states in anarchy. This is actually a much better place for the terrorists to be. And I think we already have reports of thousands of foreign fighters coming back into Afghanistan. So I'm not saying this terrorist threat will occur tomorrow. It will take some time to rebuild their capabilities, but I see it as a very, very high probability.
Moving on to the widely discussed AUKUS deal between the United States, Australia, and the UK, you recently wrote a piece in The Economist, and you write, quote, "It marks a sit-up-and-take-notice moment, perhaps a genuine pivot."
The idea for AUKUS really, I think, is a new idea that creates a new hard power alliance to put these nuclear-propelled submarines into the water. I don't think everything else needs to look like that, but I think it points a way forward. You can have a lot of different combinations in a lot of different ways with different countries to meet the Chinese threat. And one good example of that is the first in-person meeting of the leaders of the Quad at the White House, hosted by President Biden with Prime Minister Modi, Prime Minister Suga, Prime Minister Morrison. The four countries involved are all directly concerned about different aspects of what China's up to. They may come at it from different perspectives, but I think the mere fact they're talking together in this format is important, and it suggests there are other ways to put together alliances on different issues that concern people. I don't think one size fits all. I don't think you ought to try and reach for that kind of solution. I think you're going to have a number of different solutions. Some may look like AUKUS, some may look like something else. But this is really encouraging that we're seeing broader understanding and concern about the Chinese threat.
But there's also been skepticism that a raw deal would be handed over to other Quad partners like India. Is that a valid concern?
Well, I think that, in this particular case, India has its own nuclear-propelled submarines. But the idea of sharing technology, of making weapon systems interoperable, getting the kind of capability that NATO has, moving in that direction, I think is something we should all take a look at. Japan, not a nuclear power. I bet they want nuclear-powered submarines. But the precedent that's set here is really much broader, and different countries may not want to go that far. That's fine. That's why you need different arrangements that can be fitted to the circumstances that we face.
Is this the best U.S.-India alliance and partnership we've seen so far?
Well, I think this is this Quad development has been evidence of the growing closeness of the relationship. There's still a lot of issues that have to be overcome. The air defense systems purchased from Russia, for example, is still an issue, and but these are things that can be discussed, and I think in a four-country format that helps the discussion. I think everybody's worried about what China's up to in all different kinds of ways. India has a land border with China, and there have been incidents along the line of actual control of real Chinese hostilities. So these are things that we need an exchange of views on, a chance to get closer. I think the Quad should be open to participation by other countries, but you could also imagine, say, India and Australia dealing with some Southeast Asian countries, just the two of them and others, or Japan and the U.S. dealing with Pacific Island states, that kind of thing. There are a lot of different ways you can put this together.
And just in terms of the bilateral relationship between India and the United States, what might be the areas of disagreements and possibly tension?
Right. Well, in the Cold War, India purchased a very substantial amount of weapon systems from Russia. And so the legacy systems that India has are incompatible with U.S. and NATO-compatible systems. So I think to get more interoperability, there's going to have to be a transformation of India's weapons strategy. It doesn't have to be all U.S. It could be French, it could be Swedish, British. There are a lot of possibilities that are NATO compliant. And I know that's a hard decision for India. These budget questions are always hard. Look, trade is always a contentious issue. We've had contentious trade issues with Japan and the European Union, and that's going to require negotiation too. But the main point is that seeing now there's a common danger to all of us, that can help facilitate people concentrating on what's really critical in the relationship, and that's finding the areas of agreement and making progress on them.
And finally, with so much attention and focus on the Indo-Pacific region, is America forging new alliances?
Yeah, I think what the United States is doing is broadening and deepening the structure of alliances that it's had. And that's why AUKUS is symbolic in another way. The U.S. in the past has had transatlantic alliances with Europe, and it's had Pacific alliances with Japan, South Korea, Australia. AUKUS is an Atlantic and Pacific alliance, and I think there's a lot of ways in which that can be expanded. Jose Maria Aznar, the former Prime Minister of Spain, said he thought NATO ought to be made global. This is 15 years ago, bringing in Japan, Singapore, Israel, Australia, for example. That may not happen now, given France's concern, but look, I think you've got to look at this in looking forward in the full extent of the challenge that's posed, and China is a worldwide challenge. So it's an awkward period, but that doesn't mean that we either have to insist on one perfect structure, which doesn't exist, or that we should simply sit back and not do anything at all. It's a period that calls for creativity and diplomacy and strategy, and I think it's important we get moving.
Ambassador Bolton, thank you for joining us on WION, World is One.